A rapper drops a platinum single, and 3 years later, he's pawning his own jewelry to make rent. That's not rare. That's the business model. It's never a stranger who takes the money. It's the contract he signed, the advisor he trusted, or the label running his accounts. He loses his masters, his money disappears, and sometimes a federal indictment is waiting at the end of it. Here's why it happens to almost every single one of them. Ever wonder how a kid raised inside a record label by the man he called his own father figure ends up suing that same man for $51 million? That's exactly what happened to Lil Wayne. He joined Cash Money Records at 9 years old, mentored by label boss Brian Williams, the man the world knows as Birdman. By his teens, he was running with the Hot Boys. And by 2008, the Carter III made him the biggest rapper alive, moving more than 1 million copies in his first week alone. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was the face of the label, and Birdman called him his son in nearly every interview either man gave. Then Cash Money handed Wayne something that looked like a reward, a joint venture called Young Money, which went on to sign 2 artists named Drake and Nicki Minaj before either of them became 2 of the biggest names on the planet. Sounds like Wayne hit the jackpot, right? Here's the catch. Cash Money reportedly held the majority stake in Young Money, with Wayne owning a significant minority share. On paper, that's a partnership. In practice, it's a leash, because Birdman's company still controlled the larger share of every dollar the artists Wayne discovered were bringing in. By January 2015, the whole thing blew up. Wayne sued his own mentor for $51 million, claiming Cash Money withheld $8 million of a promised $10 million advance for the Carter V, buried his financial records, and never paid him properly for handing the label its next Drake. Months earlier, he'd already gone scorched earth on Twitter, calling himself a prisoner of his own label and saying he wanted nothing more to do with the people running it. And here's the part that makes it worse. Cash Money controlled Wayne's masters and distribution. Wayne owned talent and a problem. Delaying an album could delay the revenue and the payments tied to it from ever starting to flow. And a contract does nothing for you if the other side controls the timeline. The case dragged on for 3 years before both sides quietly settled in 2018. And to this day, nobody outside the room knows exactly how much money changed hands. Here's the kicker though. That lawsuit wasn't even the end of it. Wayne turned around and sued Cash Money's distributor, Universal Music Group, for more than $40 million. He alleged Universal was quietly paying off a $100 million advance. It gave Cash Money by skimming straight from Young Money's royalties. The same royalties owed to Wayne, Drake, and Nicki Minaj. And Wayne wasn't even the first artist to learn this lesson. Cash Money's own in-house producer, Mannie Fresh, the man behind Bling Bling and Back That Ass Up, walked away from the label back in 2005 over the identical complaint, later saying flat out that he left because of money. Producers have been suing Cash Money for unpaid royalties since the label's earliest years in the 90s. Wayne wasn't reporting a glitch. He was the latest name on a list that had been growing for 2 decades before he ever picked up a phone to call a lawyer. Wayne survived it. He's still one of the most respected rappers alive. But it took a man who'd been working since he was a literal child, who helped build another label's 2 biggest stars from inside his own deal, 3 years, and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit just to get paid what he was already owed. Call it whatever you want. On paper, it's a robbery with better lawyers. What happens when the deal that makes you famous is also the deal designed to keep you broke? Ask Megan Thee Stallion. She signed with 1501 Certified Entertainment in 2018 when she was 20 years old and still mostly known just around Houston. The label was run by Carl Crawford, a former professional baseball player turned music executive. Rolling Stone later obtained and reviewed her actual contract, reporting it included a $10,000 signing bonus as an advance, which on paper probably felt like a real opportunity. According to that reporting, the contract gave 1501 60% of her recording income and 30% of everything she made from touring and merchandise, with all of her own recording costs deducted before she ever saw a royalty. The outlet also reported that the label's publishing arm walked away with half ownership of her songwriting copyrights. She was 20. Nobody had read her the fine print yet. By 2019, she'd broken into the mainstream, and she finally brought in real management through Jay-Z's Roc Nation. That's when the lawyers actually explained what she'd signed. Here's the part that stings. She didn't find out her own deal was lopsided from a friend or a mentor. she found out from professionals she'd hired specifically to check paperwork nobody had checked for her at 20. What followed was 3 straight years of lawsuits. In 2020, Megan sued 1501, calling the contract unconscionable, and a judge granted her a temporary restraining order, clearing the way for her Sugar EP to drop on schedule after the label tried to block it. In 2021, she had to go back to court again, just to release a remix of BTS's Butter, because 1501 tried to stop that too. Then in 2022, the fight turned into a dispute over whether her album, Something for the Hotties, even legally counted as an album under her contract, since the answer determined how many more projects she still owed the label. She sought more than $1 million in damages, claiming 1501 underpaid her royalties and piled on inflated marketing charges that came straight out of her cut. By 2023, she alleged the label was deliberately keeping its own bank accounts under $10,000, even though millions had passed through them, so there would be nothing left for a court to order them to hand over. Here's the kicker. The case never even reached a verdict. After 3 years of litigation, both sides settled quietly in October 2023, and neither side has ever said what changed hands. Crawford's defense the whole time was that the deal was generous for an unproven artist, and in a strange way, he wasn't entirely wrong. It probably was standard for someone with zero leverage. That's exactly the problem. Standard for a 20-year-old with no leverage, and fair for an artist who just broke records are two very different things. And most artists don't find out which one they signed until somebody else's lawyer reads it out loud to them years later. By the end of it, one of the biggest rappers alive had spent 3 years and untold legal fees just trying to get free of a contract she signed before she'd ever had a single platinum record to her name. So how does a guy who sold 10 million copies of one album end up with the IRS at his door? Nelly's version of getting robbed didn't come from a label or a manager. It came from the government, and it's the kind of robbery almost nobody sees coming until the letter actually shows up. In 2000, Nelly released Country Grammar, and it didn't just sell, it became one of the rare hip-hop albums to ever go diamond, crossing 10 million copies sold. 2 years later, Nellyville added Hot in Here and Dilemma to the catalog, cementing him as one of the biggest crossover stars rap had ever produced, the kind of star who ends up on lunchboxes and late-night television, not just the radio. Then, in 2016, TMZ dropped a number that didn't match the image at all. The IRS had hit Nelly with a federal tax lien worth more than $2.4 million for unpaid taxes dating back to 2013. Missouri's Department of Revenue was separately chasing him for another $150,000 in unpaid state taxes from the same year. A lien like that gives the government the legal right to start seizing property if the debt goes unpaid. Here's what almost nobody clocks about touring and feature money. A regular job takes taxes out of every paycheck automatically, before the money even reaches the employee. Touring income, feature checks, and licensing payouts don't work that way. The full amount lands in the account untouched, and the artist is supposed to set aside roughly a third to half of it for the IRS later. Almost nobody does, because money sitting in an account doesn't feel like a bill that's already due. It feels like cash already earned. By the time the actual bill shows up, years of interest have piled on top of it. Then something genuinely strange happened. Nelly started working with the IRS to pay the debt down, and his own fans organized around it without anyone asking them to. Word spread online that streaming his catalog harder would push his royalty payouts up and chip away at what he owed. And one widely shared calculation at the time put the number at over 400 million additional streams needed to make a real dent. Whether or not the math actually worked, his streaming numbers spiked for weeks. A man who sold 10 million albums needed his own fan base to help bail him out of a bill that had quietly built up over years. Now, this next individual isn't exactly a rapper, but he shaped a massive part of the era anyway. Scott Storch spent almost a decade creating some of the most important sounds in hip-hop, and his financial collapse might be the most dramatic one on this entire list. Storch got his start playing keys for The Roots before becoming Dr. Dre's go-to collaborator, co-writing the iconic riff on Still DRE. By the mid-2000s, he was the most in-demand producer in the business, credited on multiple Billboard #1 singles, including Beyoncé's Baby Boy, 50 Cent's Candy Shop, and Chris Brown's Run It. His peak net worth has been reported anywhere between $70 and $100 million. Then, in 2006, A serious cocaine addiction took hold, and everything that built the fortune started tearing it down just as fast. He reportedly owned a fleet of luxury cars, some worth hundreds of thousands of dollars each, plus a 117-foot yacht, a private jet, and a $10.5 million mansion on Miami's Palm Island. By his own account, he once spent $30 million in a single 6-month stretch. He stopped showing up to sessions on time, and he reportedly kept Janet Jackson waiting at the studio for 10 hours while he partied somewhere else. Word travels fast in that business, and the bookings started drying up. By 2008, he'd fallen behind on child support and property taxes. In 2009, he filed for bankruptcy, having burned through the fortune entirely. The bank foreclosed on his Palm Island mansion not long after, and in one of the stranger footnotes on this list, that exact house eventually sold to Birdman in 2012, the same Birdman from earlier in this video. Storch was arrested on cocaine charges in Las Vegas in 2012. Then in 2015, he filed for bankruptcy a second time. In the paperwork, he listed his total assets at $3,600, $100 in cash, $500 in clothing, and a $3,000 watch. He valued his entire music company at zero, and he reported making just $10,000 the whole previous year. Storch eventually got sober, and he's since rebuilt a career producing for artists like Post Malone and DJ Khaled. But the gap between $100 million and $3,600 in assets is the steepest swing in this entire video, and almost none of it came from a label, an advisor, or the IRS. This time, he robbed himself. One car and one binge at a time. One more name on this list isn't a rapper either, but without him, half the artists in this video might not have had careers to lose money from in the first place. Suge Knight co-founded Death Row Records in 1991, and within 2 years, the label had Dr. Dre's The Chronic and Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, both certified multi-platinum. By the mid-1990s, Death Row was reportedly generating somewhere between $100 and $150 million a year, with Knight himself estimated to be pulling in tens of millions annually. He also posted $1.4 million in bail for Tupac Shakur, in exchange for signing him to the label, which only added to Knight's reputation as the most powerful and most feared man in hip-hop. At his peak, his own net worth has been estimated as high as $100 to $200 million. Then it all came apart. Tupac was murdered in 1996. Dr. Dre left the label that same year, citing unpaid royalties and creative disputes. In 1997, Knight went to prison for nearly 5 years on a parole violation, and Death Row kept losing money the entire time he was gone. In 2005, a judge awarded $107 million to Lydia Harris, who claimed she'd co-founded Death Row using money from her husband in a civil judgment tied to the label's origins. By 2006, Knight filed for personal bankruptcy, claiming just $11 in his bank account against more than $137 million in debt. The court ordered a bankruptcy trustee to take over Death Row Records entirely, citing out what the court called gross mismanagement. In 2009, Death Row's masters, publishing rights, and name were auctioned off in bankruptcy court for somewhere between $18 and $24 million, depending on the source. Knight didn't see a dollar of it. Every cent went to creditors. The catalog changed hands a few more times, even though before Snoop Dogg himself bought the Death Row name and brand in 2022. The broader Death Row catalog separately sold for around $240 million in 2021. Knight got nothing from that either. In 2015, Knight was involved in a fatal hit and run. He pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter in 2018 and is currently serving a 28-year prison sentence, with parole eligibility not coming until 2034. As of recent estimates, his net worth sits somewhere around $200,000, and most of what little income he has goes straight to creditors before he ever sees it. The man who built the label that made gangsta rap a billion-dollar genre is currently earning prison wages. It's the darkest irony on this entire list. The same machine that took so much from the artists in this video eventually turned around and took everything from the man running it too. So how does this happen to almost everybody? Here's the math nobody hands you before you sign. These are 5 completely different people and 5 completely different villains. A label that controls the money. A contract that was unfair from the day it got signed. A tax bill nobody budgeted for. an addiction that ate the fortune from the inside. And finally, the whole machine, turning on the man running it. That's what makes this format so frustrating to watch from the outside. There isn't one bad guy to point at and avoid. There are several, and most people in this industry run into more than one of them across a single career. Start with the advance, because almost every one of these stories begins there. Say a label hands a new artist $1 million advance. Sounds like $1 million in the bank. It isn't. It's a loan against future earnings, and the label typically controls and approves how it gets spent. Maybe $400,000 goes to recording. Another $300,000 disappears into marketing and music videos. Another $100,000 vanishes into tour support. By the time the album actually drops, the artist is already $1 million in debt to his own label, and royalties don't start landing in his pocket until that debt clears first. Then stack management and legal fees on top, usually 15 to 20% combined, taken before the artist sees a dollar of what's left. Then add the IRS, which wants its share of whatever remains, plus self-employment tax, if the money came from touring or features instead of a steady paycheck. Some modern deals go even further, with what the industry calls a 360 deal, where the label takes a cut of touring, merchandise, and endorsements too, on the logic that it helped build the entire brand. None of this requires anyone to break a single law. It's baked into how the business works on a good day, long before one bad contract, one addiction, or one shady executive ever shows up. That's why this isn't really a story about a few unlucky artists. A label can hold your masters hostage, the way Cash Money did to Wayne. A deal you didn't fully understand at 20 can cost you years of your career fighting to get free of it, the way it did for Megan. The government can quietly add up a bill you never knew you owed, the way it did to Nelly. Your own success can hand you the rope, the way it did for Storch. And if you're the one running the machine instead of signed to it, the machine can still come back around and take everything from you too, the way it did tonight. Getting robbed isn't the exception in this industry. It's written into the paperwork, the lifestyle, and sometimes the entire business model. And the only real difference between the person who survives it and the one who doesn't is whether somebody understood what they were signing up for before it was too late. One more thing worth sitting with. Remember how Wayne and Birdman settled, and neither side ever said how much money changed hands? Same with Megan and 1501. That's not unusual. Most of these disputes end with a confidentiality clause attached, which means the public gets the headline and almost never gets the real ending. The artist gets paid, or doesn't, quietly, and the label walks away without ever admitting what it did. Even when an artist wins, the industry still controls how the story gets told. Not everybody got caught in it, though. Master P built No Limit Records in the 90s on a distribution deal that let him keep ownership of his own masters and a far bigger cut of every sale than almost anyone else in the genre, while his peers were signing away both for a fraction of the money. Funny enough, he even shows up inside one of the stories you just heard. Master P personally negotiated with Suge Knight to bring Snoop Dogg over to No Limit after Snoop's exit from Death Row in 1998, while the label's own founder was busy losing everything else. Master P has preached product over talent and ownership over hype for years. And while other labels were handing out the kind of deals that buried TLC and Toni Braxton, he quietly built one of the only hip-hop business models from that era that actually protected the artist instead of the executive. Drop a comment with the person you think got robbed the worst, because after everything in this video, you've got plenty of options. I'll see you in the next one.